In the dusty town of Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, a drifting cowboy finds himself facing the gallows for a crime he didn't commit. The stolen gold belongs to the most powerful family in 3 counties, and everyone believes justice is being served. But when the truth finally comes to light, it will expose a web of corruption that reaches all the way to the judge's bench, and the real thief is someone no one saw coming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Falls as Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway led his horse to the hitching post outside the courthouse. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles over a town when justice hangs in the balance. Word had spread fast about the arrest, and by dawn, folks were gathering on porches and street corners, whispering about what would happen next. 3 days earlier, the Whitmore family's safe had been cracked open like an egg, cleaned out of every piece of gold and silver inside Judge Harrison. Whitmore was the wealthiest man in the territory, owning the largest ranch, the biggest mine, and half the businesses that lined Cedar Falls' dusty streets. When someone stole from the Whitmores, they weren't just stealing money. They were stealing from the foundation that held the entire town together. The evidence seemed clear as mountain water. Colt Patterson, a weathered cowboy with calloused hands and a face marked by years under the prairie sun, had been found passed out drunk behind Murphy's saloon with a leather pouch containing 3 gold coins bearing the Whitmore family crest. The same coins that had been locked in Judge Whitmore's personal safe just hours before. Colt had ridden into Cedar Falls 2 weeks prior, looking for work and carrying nothing but his bedroll, his father's old Winchester, and the kind of quiet desperation that comes from too many towns and too few opportunities. He'd found temporary work at the livery stable, mucking stalls and tending horses for 50 cents a day. It wasn't much, but it kept food in his belly and gave him a place to sleep in the hayloft. Nobody really knew Colt Patterson. He was just another drifter, another face passing through a town that had seen plenty of both. He kept to himself, did his work without complaint, and spent his evenings sitting on the porch of the boarding house, whittling small figures from scraps of wood. The only conversations he had were with old Pete Morrison, who ran the livery, and even those were mostly about horses and weather. But being unknown in a place like Cedar Falls was dangerous when something went wrong. When fingers needed pointing, they pointed at strangers first. The morning after the robbery, Sheriff Tom Bradley had found Colt unconscious in the alley, reeking of whiskey and clutching that damning leather pouch. The gold coins inside weren't just any coins. They were part of a special collection that Judge Whitmore kept in his private safe, each one marked with the family crest that had been hand-engraved by a craftsman in Denver. There was no mistaking where they'd come from. Colt claimed he couldn't remember how he'd gotten the coins. The last thing he recalled was having a single drink at Murphy's saloon after finishing his work at the livery. Everything after that was blank, lost in a fog that whiskey sometimes creates but rarely explains. His story sounded exactly like what a guilty man would say when caught red-handed. The townspeople had made up their minds before the trial even began. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where reputation mattered more than evidence, where a man's word was measured by how long he'd lived there and how much property he owned. Colt Patterson had neither time nor property on his side. Judge Whitmore, despite being the victim of the crime, insisted on presiding over the case himself. He claimed it was his duty to ensure justice was served properly, that no conflict of interest existed because the law was bigger than any personal grievance. The territorial authorities had no reason to question him. Harrison Whitmore had been serving as a judge for over 15 years, and his reputation for fairness was known throughout Montana Territory. But fairness, like everything else in Cedar Falls, seemed to flow in the direction of money and influence. The trial lasted exactly 1 day. The prosecutor, a thin man named Edgar Sims, who owed his position to Judge Whitmore's recommendation, presented his case with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before he started. The evidence was simple and damning. Colt had been found with the stolen gold. The safe showed signs of being expertly cracked, and Colt had worked around horses and leather goods long enough to know his way around locks and mechanisms. Colt's defense attorney, A young lawyer named James Mitchell, who had only been practicing for 2 years, did his best with an impossible case. He pointed out that Colt had never been in trouble with the law before. He questioned how a man who earned 50 cents a day could afford enough whiskey to pass out drunk. He wondered aloud why an experienced thief would be so careless as to fall asleep with the evidence in his pocket. But questions weren't answers, and the jury of 12 local men had already decided what they believed. They deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a guilty verdict. Judge Whitmore sentenced Colt Patterson to hang at dawn on Friday, 3 days hence. As the gavel fell and the sentence was pronounced, something flickered across Judge Whitmore's face. It wasn't satisfaction or relief, the emotions you might expect from a victim seeing justice served. It was something harder to read, something that looked almost like regret, but it passed so quickly that anyone who noticed it might have convinced themselves they'd imagined it. Colt accepted the verdict without protest, the same way he'd accepted everything else that had happened to him in Cedar Falls. He was led back to his cell in the small jailhouse behind the courthouse, his shackles clanking against the wooden floor. Deputy Bradley locked the cell door with a heavy iron key and hung it on a peg just out of reach. The cell was barely large enough for a grown man to lie down in. It had a single small window that looked out onto the alley where Colt had been found, and a wooden bucket that served purposes better left unmentioned. The walls were carved with the names and final messages of previous occupants, some dating back nearly 20 years. As night fell over Cedar Falls, the town settled into an uneasy quiet. Most folks tried to go about their evening routines, but everyone was thinking about the hanging that would take place in just 3 days. Some believed justice was being served. Others wondered if they really knew what justice looked like anymore. In his cell, Colt Patterson sat on the thin straw mattress and tried to piece together the fragments of his memory from that night. He remembered finishing his work at the livery just as the sun was setting. He remembered walking toward Murphy's saloon, thinking that one drink might help him sleep better. He remembered the bartender, a heavy-set man named Murphy, who kept his establishment cleaner than most, pouring him a whiskey from a bottle that caught the lamplight. But after that, everything disappeared into blackness until he woke up in the alley with Sheriff Bradley standing over him, and that leather pouch clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime he couldn't remember committing. The strange thing was, Colt had never been much of a drinker. One glass of whiskey shouldn't have affected him the way it apparently had, and he'd never stolen anything in his life, not even when he'd gone days without eating. But as Colt sat in that cramped cell, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall from the flickering lantern outside, pieces of that night began surfacing like debris after a flood. He remembered more clearly now the taste of that whiskey. It had been bitter, more bitter than any whiskey he'd ever drunk before, with an aftertaste that lingered long after he'd swallowed it. He remembered feeling dizzy almost immediately, his vision blurring in a way that seemed wrong for just one drink. Most importantly, he remembered seeing someone else in Murphy's saloon that night. A young man in expensive clothes, someone who didn't belong in a working man's establishment. The memory was hazy, like looking through dirty glass, but the figure had been sitting in the corner booth, watching him with an intensity that had made Colt uncomfortable, even in his growing stupor. 3 cells down from Colt, another prisoner had been listening to his mumbled recollections. Jake Henley was a grizzled prospector who'd been arrested for public drunkenness and disturbing the peace he'd been in that cell for nearly a week. And his release had been delayed because he couldn't pay the $5 fine. Jake had seen and heard things in Cedar Falls that most folks preferred to ignore. "Boy," Jake whispered through the bars separating their cells, "you keep talking about someone watching you at Murphy's. You remember anything else about this fella?" Colt pressed his face against the cold iron bars, straining to see Jake in the dim light. Young man, well-dressed, had dark hair, maybe 25 years old. Kept checking a pocket watch, like he was waiting for something to happen. Jake was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that carries weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "That sounds like it could be Daniel Whitmore, the judge's boy. He's been known to frequent places his daddy wouldn't approve of, if you catch my meaning." The name hit Colt like a physical blow. Daniel Whitmore. The judge's son. The same judge who had sentenced him to hang the same family whose gold he'd supposedly stolen. "Jake," Colt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would the judge's son be watching me in Murphy's saloon?" "That's a question worth asking," Jake replied, "but it ain't one you're likely to get answered from in here." Outside the jailhouse, Cedar Falls was experiencing its own kind of restlessness. In the grand house on Elm Street, Judge Harrison Whitmore sat in his study, a crystal glass of brandy untouched on the mahogany desk beside him. The room was lined with law books, their leather spines worn smooth from years of use, and the walls were decorated with certificates and commendations from his long career on the bench. But tonight, Judge Whitmore wasn't reading law books or reviewing case files. He was staring at a photograph on his desk, a portrait of his son Daniel taken just after his graduation from the Territorial College in Helena. Daniel had been such a promising young man then, full of ambition and ideals about justice and fairness. When had things started going wrong? When had his son begun staying out all night, spending money they hadn't given him, associating with gamblers and confidence men who drifted through town like smoke? When had Daniel's eyes taken on that hard, desperate look that Judge Whitmore recognized from years of sentencing men who'd made poor choices? A soft knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Not looking up from the photograph, Daniel Whitmore entered the room, moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to appear nervous. He was indeed a handsome young man, with his father's strong jaw and his mother's dark eyes. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been present in that college graduation photograph. "Father," Daniel said, settling into the leather chair across from the desk. "I heard the trial went well today, justice served and all that." Judge Whitmore finally looked up, studying his son's face with the same intensity he used when evaluating testimony in his courtroom. "Yes, the evidence was quite clear. The Patterson fellow will hang on Friday." "Good," Daniel said, perhaps a bit too quickly. "I mean, it's good that justice is being served, that the family's property is being protected." There was something in Daniel's voice, a note that didn't ring true. Judge Whitmore had spent decades listening to men lie under oath, and he knew the sound of deception when he heard it. But this was his son, his own flesh and blood. Surely he was imagining things. "Daniel," the judge said carefully, "I've been meaning to ask you about your whereabouts 3 nights ago when the safe was broken into." Daniel's hand moved unconsciously toward his vest pocket, where the outline of his pocket watch was visible. "I was at the hotel, playing cards with some fellows from out of town. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. It's natural for a father to wonder about his son's activities, especially when crime is afoot in our community." "Of course," Daniel said, standing up from the chair with what seemed like relief. "Well, I should let you get back to your work. I know you have a busy schedule preparing for the execution." After Daniel left the study, Judge Whitmore sat alone with his brandy and his doubts. Something wasn't right about this entire situation, but he couldn't put his finger on what troubled him most. Was it the speed with which the case had been solved? The convenience of finding Colt Patterson passed out with the evidence? Or was it something else entirely, something closer to home that he didn't want to acknowledge? Meanwhile, at Murphy's saloon, the proprietor himself was having his own troubled thoughts. Murphy O'Brien had been running his establishment for 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing his customers and their habits. He remembered serving Colt Patterson that night, remembered the young cowboy ordering just one whiskey and nursing it slowly, like a man who couldn't afford to waste money on liquor. What Murphy couldn't stop thinking about was what had happened after he'd served that drink. He'd been wiping down glasses behind the bar when he noticed the young Whitmore boy approach Colt's table. Daniel had said something to the cowboy, something Murphy couldn't hear over the general noise of the saloon. But he remembered seeing Daniel's hand hover near Colt's glass while they talked. At the time, Murphy had assumed it was just friendly conversation between two young men. Now, with Colt sitting in jail awaiting execution, That brief interaction seemed more significant. Murphy had been around long enough to know that sometimes the most important details were the ones that seemed insignificant at first glance. The problem was, Murphy also knew the power of the Whitmore family in Cedar Falls. Judge Whitmore owned the building that housed Murphy's saloon. One word from the judge could close his business permanently, leaving Murphy with nothing but debts and bitter memories. So Murphy kept his suspicions to himself, the same way most folks in Cedar Falls kept their doubts and questions locked away, where they couldn't cause trouble. It was easier to believe that justice was being served, that the right man was going to pay for his crimes, than to consider the possibility that everything they thought they knew was wrong. But truth has a way of fighting to the surface, even in places where it's not welcome. And in Cedar Falls, Montana territory, the truth was about to emerge in ways that no one expected, least of all the judge who thought he'd buried it along with his son's guilt. The truth, when it finally broke free in Cedar Falls, came not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet persistence of water finding cracks in stone. By the time the real story emerged, it had already cost too much, changed too many lives, and reminded everyone in that dusty Montana town that justice isn't always what it appears to be. Colt Patterson's name was cleared, but the damage had been done. Daniel Whitmore faced his own reckoning, and Judge Harrison Whitmore learned that the heaviest gavel of all is the one that falls on your own family. The people of Cedar Falls discovered something they'd always known but never wanted to admit, that power and influence can corrupt even the scales of justice when good people choose to look the other way. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about who deserves our protection and who deserves our doubt. In a world where a man's worth is measured by his name rather than his character, the innocent will always be at risk of paying for crimes they didn't commit. And sometimes the real thieves are sitting right there in plain sight, protected by nothing more than reputation and fear. The next time you see someone being judged before their story is fully told, remember Colt Patterson, and remember that truth has a way of surfacing, even when the whole town conspires to keep it buried.